So our talk tonight is on the emotions, or passions, and temperament. And the emotions is a beautiful illustration of the theme that we've been focusing on, man's place in the hierarchy of creation. And we saw in our first talk that our place is precisely the intersection of the material world and the spiritual world, the material creation and the spiritual creation. And human emotions are a beautiful illustration of our place at that intersection. Right? So we share them with the animals. Animals also have passions, and they have the same fundamental passions that we have, and we'll see that. But passions in a human being are profoundly marked by being the passions of a rational, free, spiritual creature. And so they partake of our spiritual part, and thus they're ennobled and elevated immensely above how passions exist in the animal world. Okay, so before we look at the passions or emotions in particular, let's just look in general at, because passions or emotions are a kind of inclination. So let's start by looking at inclination. Now we see in our common sense experience of the world that everything, every nature, everything that we find in creation isn't simply static, but is moved by God, is given a nature that is inclined to its proper end. Even a rock is inclined to the center of gravitational field. Plants are inclined to grow, to receive light, to do photosynthesis, to do what plants do. And animals, even we see it even more clearly, are inclined to do what their instincts lead them to do. And we too have inclinations. And so we can distinguish three levels of inclinations in nature. There's the kind of inclination that's in rocks that we can call just a natural inclination without any knowledge at all, and also in plants. And so it's common to all beings. Even our own, for example, our eye has a natural inclination to see, and our ear to hear, and prior to any knowledge. It's just its nature. But in creatures with knowledge, there's inclination in a higher way. There's inclination to the objects of our sense knowledge that we know to be good for us, or an inclination away from the things that we know to be bad for us. So creatures with knowledge have a different kind of inclination than just the rock to the center. And so and that would be animals, all animals, irrational animals, and rational ones, us. And so we call that sense appetite. It's an appetite that follows on sense knowledge. And so when the lion sees its prey, it has an appetite for that prey that is aroused by seeing the deer. Right? Before seeing the deer, the lion had a natural inclination to eat deer. But after it sees the deer, it has a conscious inclination, a movement of its sense appetite to eat the deer. And so that appetite is aroused by knowledge. And so it's a higher thing than just the inclination of a rock to the center. And it's what makes the animal world so marvelous, is that they have these movements, passions, based on their knowledge, sense knowledge of the world, based on seeing and hearing and smelling and sensing. Okay, so it's a kind of, so sense appetite is an appetite aroused by sense knowledge. And we have it too. Right? So we see a piece of chocolate cake, and perhaps especially if we're fasting in Lent, and when we see it, that creates a movement of our sense appetite to desire the cake, even if we don't eat it. Right? But there's still prior to our deliberation, there's some kind of movement to it, and that's sense appetite. Now, we've seen that there are two different kinds of knowledge, fundamentally different: sense knowledge and intellectual knowledge. And so sense knowledge is the knowledge that we get through our 5 external senses, and it's always of particular things. And we also have internal senses, we saw, and those also are always of particular things, our imagination. We can imagine particular goods, particular things. And so that kind of knowledge generates one kind of appetite, sense appetite. But we also have intellectual knowledge of goods that are, say, universal goods, or goods that are spiritual. Truth, virtue, justice, beauty, love, communion, friendship. And so when we know those things as goods, there's a desire for those spiritual goods. And that's a different kind of appetite. We call it the will. It's an intellectual appetite. It's an appetite for things that the intellect grasps to be good. And that's an appetite that's proper to the rational creature, or to rational being, to human beings, angels, and in a higher way, infinitely higher way, to God. Right? And that's the will. And we call it, in man, it's our rational appetite. Now, the word appetite is probably maybe throwing you off, because we usually use the word appetite for dinner or lunch. And philosophers use it in a much broader sense as precisely a faculty of loving and desiring goods known. And so we have a sense appetite for goods known, desiring goods known by senses, particular goods. And another faculty for desiring, loving, or also hating, fearing, etc., objects known by our intellect. And so, since we have two fundamental ways of knowing, sense knowledge and intellectual knowledge, we have two appetites: sense appetite and rational appetite, or will. Right? The sense appetite we have in common with the animals, and the rational appetite we have in common with the angels and with God. We could say that the kind of appetite a being has follows from its nature. Since we have a nature that's that of a rational animal, we've got a rational appetite, but we're also an animal. So we have an animal appetite, our sense appetite. And we experience, not infrequently, know that those two appetites can come in conflict. And so we know that we've got two of them, because they can conflict. Now, both of these appetites, sense appetite and the rational, are fundamentally passive powers. Passive in the sense that they're attracted by goods that are out. In other words, the object moves the appetite. So, for example, the lion. He sees the deer. That knowledge of the deer out there moves his appetite to desire it. So you can see his appetite is, in that sense, passive. It's being worked on by the object, the deer. And the same case for us in the case of, the steak dinner, or the chocolate cake, or whatever it is that we're desiring. And even spiritual things, truth or beauty, also is, in a sense, active, and our will is passive in the sense of being attracted to it, being drawn towards it. And the same thing would be true of justice and truth and and goodness and holiness. Now the will also has an active power. But that's because then once it's been attracted to something, let's take to holiness, then it can command our other faculties to do things, to seek it. And so in that sense it's active. But it's first passive in the sense of being attracted by a good that's out there. Okay. Plato, in his Republic, he's the first one that I know of that speaks about these two appetites in man in a clear way, and he uses this argument of the fact that they frequently conflict. That's the argument by which he shows that we have two, right? The will and the sense appetite. Okay, let's start by looking at our sense appetite, and then we'll move on later to the will. So we're shifting to the appetite that we have in common with the animals. Now this one, I'm going to try your patience here. We're going to also divide into two. So our sense appetite, not just ours, but also that of all the animals, has, we could say, two aspects, or actually two appetites on the sense level. And philosophers call them the concupiscible appetite, that desires pleasurable goods and flees from painful evils, and what they call the irascible appetite. And an irascible person, someone prone to anger. So the irascible appetite is related to anger. And we could call it an aggressive appetite, an appetite that involves struggle and thus also anger could be. Let's start with the first one, the pleasure appetite or concupiscible appetite. And the most basic level of sense appetite is the attraction to what's good for our senses. In other words, pleasurable goods. And that would be the example that we've used, the chocolate cake, the deer for the lion. And so pleasurable goods are loved in general. They're desired when we don't have them, but they're out there. And we rejoice in them when they're present, when we get them. Right? So, for example, we love whatever it may be, steak dinner in general, and we desire it when we're hungry and we don't have it, and then when we're possess it, we rest in that and rejoice. But that's not enough to explain what animals do. Because sometimes they have passions that aren't directly for pleasurable goods. And that would be, for example, very often we seek things that are difficult and thus involve struggle before we get that pleasurable good. So before we can get that pleasurable good that we're seeking, first perhaps we have to do something very difficult that in and of itself doesn't attract as a kind of pleasure. So for example, animals that they want to mate the dominant female. But before they do that, they have to fight all the other males. And that's not directly pleasurable. No? And so there has to be some other appetite than merely to pleasurable goods. If animals and also human beings, if we only had a concupiscible appetite, a pleasure appetite, we would never do the difficult things to get difficult goods. In other words, we'd be spineless and and we would never do anything that involved any effort or struggle. But we see, obviously, that's not the case. It's not the case in human affairs, and it's not the case in the animal world either. Right? Animals do incredibly arduous things that aren't immediately pleasurable. And so there's some other emotions besides merely desire and satisfaction. And these two we can experience, they conflict sometimes. So that if we look at, say, an emotion of desire and an emotion of anger, when the one predominates, the other subsides, and vice versa. And so that's a sign that there are two different appetites there. They can conflict with one another, say desire for pleasure and desire for difficult goods, anger, aggression, and the one eclipses the other, as it were. We'll come back to this in a minute. But first, let's ask another question. These appetites in us, do they obey our higher appetite? And do they obey reason? Well, they better, right? So the answer is yes, they can, and they better. But then, to what extent can they resist? And obviously, human experience shows that not only they can, but they do resist, and frequently. And they have a weighty power to resist reason and to prevail over what our will has resolved to do. Right? We see a rational good, whatever it may be, temperance. And yet, we all know that a passion of the sense appetite can shake one's resolution for, say, pursuing temperance. And so the passions seduce our reason and our will very frequently. But we also see that in that struggle that we experience between passion and reason and will, we can also be victorious. Right? In other words, we don't have to be seduced. We may be seduced, or we may conquer the seduction. St. Francis de Sales has a beautiful treatment of the passions in his treatise on the love of God. It's magnificent. And he speaks of the passions in man and our sensual appetite in general as it's subject. No, it's subject to reason because it's below. But what kind of subject? It's a rebellious subject. It's restive, seditious. And we cannot so defeat it that it doesn't rise again. Right? We defeat it today, it rises again tomorrow. Yet the will has such a strong hand over it that she is able, if she please, to bridle it, to break its designs, to repulse it. Since not to consent is already a sufficient repulse. And so we can hinder concupiscence. We can't hinder it from conceiving. In other words, we can't stop from being tempted. But we can hinder it from bringing forth and accomplishing its aim. In other words, giving into the temptation. And so we could say man's life is marked by the fact that we have these two fundamental levels of appetite, the rational and the sensual, and then the fact that our sense appetite is also divided into a pleasure appetite and an appetite that involves struggle, concupiscible and irascible, or if we like, pleasure appetite and aggressive appetite. And that marks human life every day of our life. And this conflict is, we could say it's it's a consequence, a natural consequence, on the one hand, of being what we are, a rational animal. Right? That's our definition. And so, since we're rational, we have a rational appetite. And since we're also an animal, we have sense knowledge, we have a sense appetite. And if God weren't to do something above our nature, they're going to come into conflict. And the lower has to submit to the higher, but very often it turns out the other way around. Right? The higher actually follows the lower when we get seduced, and that's a major cause of sin. Now, in the beginning, God willed that Adam and Eve not experience this conflict. Right? That was one of the chief beauties of the Garden of Eden, is that Adam and Eve didn't experience the conflict between their sensual appetite and their rational appetite, but not simply in virtue of human nature, in virtue of a gift above nature. It's the preternatural gift of integrity, philosophers call it. And there was a gift by which their lower appetite was subjected to their higher in such a way that it couldn't rebel, that it didn't have rebellious movements, that it followed reason, as long as reason and will were subject to God. Right? So when Adam and Eve rebelled in their higher part against God by eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and so by rebelling, by not having their higher part subjected to God as a just consequence and penalty, their lower part, the sense appetite, was no longer made subject to their higher appetite, the rational appetite, the will. And that marks human life ever since. It's natural, but it's the fruit in us of original sin. That's a little confusing. In other words, in Eden, Adam and Eve were elevated above the condition of merely a rational animal. They were given gifts that were higher than human nature. Preternatural gifts and supernatural gifts. Grace, faith, hope, and charity, the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Okay. So since we've lost those gifts, we have this conflict as a kind, we could say, as an arena in which we can merit, in which we merit precisely by resisting temptation and not consenting. That struggle is an occasion for merit and growth in virtue. So how does reason govern our sense appetite? I'm going to say 3 ways. So first of all, simply by the fact that we can consent or not consent. So if my sense appetite is moved in a way contrary to what reason tells me to be just or temperate or prudent, then I can not consent. Right? So that's the first way that the passions are subject to reason. That doesn't make the passion go away, but at least it stops it from seducing my will. Right? I still have the passion, though. Secondly, reason can influence the passion more directly by what we think about, by the considerations that we make. And we all experience this. That suppose an occasion for anger comes up, and I've experienced the passion of anger. What I think about in my mind and what I imagine will have a great effect on the force of that passion. And so when this anger comes up, I think about, say, reasons for forgiveness or mercy or clemency or whatever it may be, we'll find that the anger subsides more or less rapidly, depending on our temperament, depending on what happened, etc. But if we consider the opposite, if we consider the reasons why we ought to be indignant, right, and if we go on them in detail and imagine them right there in front of our eyes, what happens? the anger grows. Right? We all experience that. And the same thing would go for any other passion. If it's desire, if I imagine the object of my desire in all its detail, what's going to happen? The desire is going to grow. Whereas if I shift my attention to other things, especially opposite kinds of things, we'll find that that passion of desire, say lust, will subside. And obviously if I look at things that are going to excite the passion will grow. Whereas if I shift my attention away from those things and don't look at them, then it will lessen. Right? So we can govern our passions also in that way, by what things we think about and imagine. And so that's the second way. Right? So I can't say, well, I couldn't help I couldn't help the first movement of the passion, but I can have an influence on what happens after that. Right? Depending on how I direct my attention. Okay. The third way is the long-term way, and it's the most effective way of governing our passions, is over the long term, if we act in accordance with, say, disordered passions, what happens? Those passions will get stronger in the long term. Right? This is how people get, for example, addictions. And if I give into a passion that's I recognize to be disordered, if I give into it once, what happens? The next time it'll be a little stronger. And if I give into it again, it'll be still a little stronger. And if I give it into it 1,000 times, what happens? It gets much, much stronger. And so I brought about a state in me in which the passions are much more vehement because I've given into them each time. Whereas suppose I do the opposite. Suppose I don't give into them once. Well, the next time it'll be a little less. And if I don't give into it 10 times, it'll be considerably less, etc. And 1,000 times, much, much less. And that's how we get virtue and vice. Right? So if we act against reason, following a passion, say 1,000 times, and suppose the passion is a disordered desire, what's going to happen? We're going to be intemperate in a stable way. We'll get a vice of intemperance or unchastity. Whereas if we do the opposite, if we act in accordance with reason, against that movement of the sense appetite that was disordered, over time, our movements of our passions are going to be more reasonable, and we'll get virtue. Right? And so virtue is precisely, when we're talking about, say, temperance or fortitude, or chastity, or patience. Virtue is precisely an education of our sense appetites over time, right? Making them habitually more and more docile to reason. Right? But it doesn't happen in a day. No, it's the work of a lifetime. Right? And so we can see from that we can govern our passions. That our passions, yes, they're rebellious subjects, but they're subjects. No? And we can govern them in those ways. But we can't govern them in the way that we say govern our limbs. Right? We govern our limbs, say, go here, and it goes there, as long as I'm not paralyzed. That's a kind of... So Aristotle, when he talks about this, he compares our dominion over our limbs to a kind of, say, in a government, a tyrannical form of government. Right? The head of the government says, go, and it goes like a slave. Whereas our passions, we can't treat like slaves. We can't just say, be quiet, and it just instantly becomes quiet. We have to persuade them, like a ruler, say, in a democracy or in a republic, where the citizens, you can't just tell them, do this or do that. You need to persuade them why it's better to do this rather than that. And so that's how we have to govern our passions. That's beautiful. Okay. Let's try now to classify them, the different passions. The word passion, I use more or less passion, emotion, feeling, more or less synonymously, passion, the Catechism, for example, says feelings or passions or movements of the sense appetite are movements that incline us to act or not to act in regard to something felt or imagined to be good or evil. Right? So it's a movement to goods that we, through knowledge, we recognize as good for us or not good for us. Right, and the word passion comes from being passive. Passio. It's this where we get the Passion of Christ. Emotion comes from to be moved out of. In other words, the object moves us, right? Attracts us. Like beauty attracts. And we use the word feeling because there's a sensible element to this. When we have passions, we feel them physically, right? We feel, for example, our heart beating, whether it's love or fear or desire. Okay. So let's try now to classify them. Can we give a definite number to the passion? That might seem ridiculous, no? How could you? There's so many. We might say there's so many different emotions. But St. Thomas Aquinas, and we could say the tradition, does classify them in an odd number. It turns out that there are 11 fundamental passions. And then there are others that we can all fit into those 11. We'll see in a minute. Now that seems like an odd number. Should have been, say, 12 would have been better. And so St. Francis de Sales, when he goes through it, he gives 12 so that it comes out nice and neat. But, well, I'll let you judge for yourselves whether they're 11 or 12. Okay, so let's start with the lowest, which would be the pleasure appetite, the concupiscible appetite. And it works by attraction or repulsion. The good attracts, and what's harmful repulses. Now, let's look at the good first. The object known as good works three things in us. In general, it arouses love. So we love in general that which is fitting for us, pleasurable goods. And so love is the first of all the emotions or passions. And that's true on the sense level, and it's true on the higher level as well. Right? Love is the primary emotion. Love is the primary movement of the will. That movement to the good. Okay, if that object, and we'll talk more about it next week. We'll have a whole talk on love and sorrow next time. Okay, if the object that we love is not present, then what does that engender? Desire, right? We desire the good that we love when it's not immediately present. But if it is present, then we get joy, right? We rejoice in the goods that we love that are present. Now suppose the object is the opposite of what we love, and thus evil. No? That draws out from us a movement of hatred. Hatred for that evil, which is the opposite of what we love. And that would be in general. And if it's not present, but it's threatening, as it were, it's out there, then that would engender in us a movement of aversion. Right? Aversion from the evil that is threatening or is sensed. And if the evil is present, then that creates sorrow. Right? And so that gives us 6. Love, desire, and joy with regard to the good, and hatred, aversion, and sorrow with regard to what's harmful, right? What's evil. Right? So love and hatred would be a pair, desire and aversion, and then joy and sorrow. Right? So I think that's relatively easy to understand. Right? Love, desire, joy, hatred, aversion, sorrow. Let's look now at the other appetite for arduous goods, for difficult goods, goods that we have to fight for and have a struggle with regard to. Now, the love would still be all of these movements of the irascible or aggressive appetite, they presuppose love. There has to be a good that we're already loving. And in this case, it's a difficult good, a good that we need to fight for. Right? So, love is presupposed. What would be our movement towards a good that we have to struggle for? Hope. Right? We hope to attain heaven. A difficult good. On the sense level, I don't know, the animal hopes to mate with that dominant female. We hope to get, I don't know, to win a championship. We hope to get into such and such a university. But we can also have an opposite movement. Even though the object that we're seeking is very, very good, we could, if we consider the obstacles, well, that can produce a movement away from that good. And we call it despair. Right? So despair is an emotion or passion moving away from a great good precisely because the obstacles seem too much. Right? Insuperable. Too difficult. So hope and despair are another pair of emotions. So now we have 8. Right? The 6 that we saw first, and now hope and despair. So hope, a movement to the difficult good, and despair, a movement away from it. Now in difficult goods, there are the reason why they're difficult is because there are obstacles in our way. Right? And so we can move towards the obstacle to defeat it, to get it out of the way. And that would be, say, the passion of courage or audacity, boldness. Right? To go to the obstacle and get rid of it. To go out and seek the fight. Right? And that presupposes hope, that you hope to overcome, and adds this boldness or courage. But, obviously there can be an opposite movement. If I look at that obstacle, and that obstacle is very, very great, that produces fear. Right? And fear is a tremendous part of human life, but also the animal life. Right? They're in frequent fear. And for good reasons. It's very good to fear when one ought to. So as to flee from obstacles that we can't overcome. Right? So fear would be a movement away from the obstacle. Boldness or audacity, a movement towards the obstacle. All right, what happens when the obstacle is present? That produces anger. Right? So anger would be the movement of our aggressive appetite to a present evil blocking us from this difficult good. Say, an injustice, a present injustice. Right? That brings forth in us anger. Precisely to overcome the evil that's present. Right? So boldness was when the evil wasn't present, but it's on the horizon. It's in the future. And anger when it's present. Now we should look for a pair there, right? So we've seen hope and despair, audacity and fear, anger, and St. Francis says, to come out to a nice 12, anger and satisfaction. Satisfaction when we've overcome that obstacle and now we've gotten justice, say. The only reason St. Thomas disagrees is because he says, well, that's satisfaction. What is it? That's joy. And so you get 11. If you prefer 11 or 12, either way is fine. I've given you a little chart here on your sheet. So love and hate in general. So love being the principle, the motor of all of the passions. And then, so love has the primacy with regard to hate, because you only hate something that's contrary to what you love. And so a hate would have no meaning if you didn't already love something. And the same thing goes for desire and joy. You couldn't possibly desire something if you didn't love it. And likewise, you wouldn't rejoice in it if you didn't love it first. And then likewise, you wouldn't hope for something if you didn't first love it. And you wouldn't despair in not acquiring it if you didn't first love it. So love is presupposed by all the others. Okay. St. Francis de Sales gives a beautiful summary. This is on page 7 in your notes here. So he sees 12 movements. He's an artist, right? He likes. So the central appetite has 12 movements, by which, as by so many mutinous captains, it raises sedition in man. Now, it's not always sedition, but very frequently sedition. And because ordinarily they trouble the soul and disquiet the body, they're called perturbations or passions. And so if the good be considered in itself, according to its natural goodness, it excites love, the first and principal passion. If it be regarded as absent, it provokes us to desire. If being desired we think we're able to obtain it, then we get hope, if it's a difficult good. If we think we cannot obtain it, then we despair. But when it's present, it moves us to joy. So that would be the positive. But with regard to things contrary to what we love, as soon as we discover evil, we hate it in general. If it's absent, we flee from it. That would be aversion. If we can't avoid it, and it's a great obstacle, we fear it. If we think we can avoid it, we grow bold and courageous. Audacity. If we feel it as present, we grieve, sorrow. And then anger and wrath suddenly rush for it to overcome it. If we can't succeed, we remain in grief or sorrow. But if we repulse it or avenge it, we feel satisfaction, which is a pleasure of triumph. Now, over all of this multitude, these 12 movements, the will governs, right? The will bears empire, rejecting their suggestions, repulsing their attacks, hindering their effects, or at least refusing them consent if they're disordered. And if we refuse them consent, they can't harm us. On the contrary, they actually help us. They help us to grow in virtue. And so if by refusing they remain vanquished, and in the long run, that's the acquisition of virtue, broken down, weakened, worn out, beaten down, and if not altogether dead, at least deadened or mortified. I think this is one of the goals of the Christian life. That's why we do what we call mortifications, right? To mortify unruly, rebellious passions, and to gradually, over time, make them docile to reason, or at least more docile. Obviously, we never finish this as long as we live. And God makes sure that we'll have, if we make progress, that we'll have perhaps harder trials, so that we can still be exercised until our dying breath. Because it's ultimately good for us. And in fact, very good for us. And that's why God permits it. Okay, so that's our sense appetite. Let's look now at our will. Are there also 11 or 12 movements of our will? Yes, the exact same ones. Right? What we've just said about the passions applies exactly also to the will. Right? They have the same love, desire, joy, hatred, aversion, sorrow, hope, despair. Right? Let's look at our desire for a good only known by intellect, heaven. Right? So our desire for that is hope. That's obviously a movement of the will, not of the sense appetite. And the despair that, say, Judas felt would be a despair, likewise, of the will, moving away from this great good because of the obstacles. What he thought, unforgivable sin. So to distinguish them, philosophers try and use a different name. The problem is, in ordinary speech, there isn't a different name for the movements of the will from the movements of the sense appetite. So we don't habitually distinguish them. So philosophers try to make a distinction by calling the one passions of the sense appetite, and affections of the will. So these movements of the will, if they're moved to an object, say, that's known by intellect, a spiritual object, virtue or holiness or truth or God or communion, then those are affections of the will. Whereas if they're aroused by sensible objects, seen or imagined, then those would be passions of the sense appetite. And so if you read spiritual authors like St. Francis de Sales or St. Ignatius of Loyola or any classical spiritual author, they'll use the words in that sense: affections of the will and passions of the sense appetite. The problem is, in ordinary language, we speak about even a cat having affection. And so it doesn't work so well in English. But in any case, we need to make a mental distinction. And so a movement of the will involves an object known by the intellect as good, known in a universal way as good, right? Like justice. So St. Francis has a beautiful explanation of this as well in his treatise on the love of God. So he says, there are no fewer movements in the intellectual or rational appetite, which is called the will, than there are in the sensitive or sensual. But the former, the movements of our will, are called customarily affections, whereas the latter are called passions, right? The sense appetite. And this is true not only in, say, Christians, but also in every human being. So a pagan, likewise, is going to experience spiritual movements of his will. So, for example, the philosophers of the pagans loved God, known by human reason. Right? So Plato and Aristotle speak of God and of the love of God. Obviously, through faith, we know God in a much fuller way, and so we can love Him in a higher way, in a supernatural way, which is charity. But even on the natural level, there's a love for spiritual goods. So the pagans loved God, in some sense. They loved the state, their country, patriotism. They loved science, virtue. They hated vice. They aspired after honor, that would be hope. They despaired of escaping death or calumny, despair. They were desirous of knowledge, or even of immortality, beatitude after death. And so all of these are movements of the will. Since the senses can't know any of those goods. And so the senses can't know whatever love of virtue, of country even, of justice, etc. So we've got two levels of love here. There's more. But even simply on the natural level, there's sense love for sensible goods, and spiritual love for goods known only by the intellect, which is a movement of the will. And the problem is, again, we don't have different words for it in English. We just have that one word, love, that indicates both levels. Right? And so even though there's not two words, we have to separate them. We have to know what we're talking about. And when we don't separate them, catastrophe happens. So people say that they stopped loving, whereas, say, in marriage, it should be a love in the will, whereas people are only thinking, if they confuse love in the will with love on the sense appetite, they think because they don't feel the palpitating of their heart the way they did when they first met their beloved, that they've fallen out of love, right? And that would be to confuse the rational appetite with the sense appetite. Okay. Even the church documents use that distinction, affections of the will, as opposed to passions of the sense appetite. Right. And another difference between these two is that the sense appetite, because it's physical, right? It involves, it's triggered by sense knowledge that involves our physical organs and for example, our brain for our imagination and memory and our exterior senses. The passion, likewise, is physical, right? And that's why we feel, say, our heart beating. That's why we get red or pale or tremble or whatnot. Right? Our whole body participates in our passions. But a purely spiritual movement wouldn't involve that. Now, in reality it does, because of our nature. We're a rational animal, and the two parts of us are intertwined. And so it's part of human experience that if we experience an affection of the will in an intense way, we'll also feel physical effects. So, for example, someone who has a spiritual movement of sorrow over sin, it's possible, but it's not necessary in any way, it's possible for them to physically feel it and to have tears. But it's in no way essential to it. No, because the spiritual movement is, by its very nature, above the movements of the beating of our heart. And that's why in the spiritual life, if we don't get tears, well, it doesn't mean that we're not, contrite. Because it's spiritual, right? It's above the bodily manifestation. Now, sometimes we also feel it, and that's because of a certain overflow. But God can subtract that overflow, in which case we won't feel it. Right? And this is, it makes us think very often that we're, for example, a spiritual joy, with the overflow we can feel it, and that's what we call very often consolations in prayer. But you see, the consolation in prayer, precisely because it's felt, is really irrelevant, right? Because it's a product of overflow. It's not directly corresponding to a spiritual movement. And so if God takes that away, it doesn't mean that we're not, say, loving or sorrowing over our sin or having compassion, etc. How should I put it? Right. In other words, the higher level, in a sense, because when we think about spiritual things, we have to use our imagination and our memory, and therefore a spiritual affection of our will, because it also involves our memory, our imagination, will naturally tend to produce also movements of the emotions on the sensitive level that we feel, because our imagination and our senses are also involved. But again, God can subtract that, if He wills, to precisely to wean us from relying too much on those consolations. Right? And so this is a normal process in the spiritual life. It's how we make the transition between different ages in the spiritual life.
Is that what they would call it, the dryness?
Exactly. Right. It can have different causes, but if God is weaning you from it to bring you to a pure state of faith, hope, and charity, well, that's what John of the Cross calls the dark night. In other words, God subtracting consolations that previously He had given, which in effect are natural.
But don't people in the dark night of this don't feel like God, they're the object of God's wrath at times?
Well, sure, because they're not feeling.
The consolation.
Exactly. They're not feeling the sensible, because to feel something, what does that mean? That means my body, right? That means some physical translation of what's a purely spiritual thing. And we're accustomed to that because it corresponds to our nature as rational animals.
So the dark night of the soul is more profound than just dryness.
Sure, it would be God weaning us of sensible aspects of consolation. And John of the Cross divides it into two nights, two different weanings. One, the night of sense, in which he subtracts the more sensible consolations. And that's really what we're mostly talking about here. Okay, we can talk more about that in questions if people have questions about that. Let's look at the passions and the moral life. So passions in themselves, just looked at abstractly in themselves, are neither good nor bad because they're natural. But because they're capable of being governed by reason, in a real person, insofar as they're voluntary, in other words, insofar as we can do the things that we said before, not consent to them, do those considerations that make the disordered passion subside, and acquire virtue to make my passions habitually docile, to the extent that I can do that and say don't, then the passions are voluntary. Like they're not purely natural. And thus they have a moral dimension. Right? Passions have a huge moral dimension in human life. For good or for bad, right? Not only for bad. Now, some schools of philosophy looked at the Stoics in particular, the ancient Stoics, looked at the passions as always being bad because it was something below reason. It was something animal in us. And so the Stoic ideal was to get rid of passion by pure willpower. And of course, human experience teaches us that we cannot do that. Right? That is, first of all, impossible. And secondly, even if you could do it, it would be catastrophic. And it would not be desirable because it would be to truncate our nature. So what we do desire is to make our passions docile to reason, not to eliminate them. And we see this above all in our Lord. He, taking on a human nature in the incarnation, didn't get rid of its passions, but we see him experience passions to an extreme. But always moved by reason. Always in perfect harmony with reason. Did anyone ever experience sorrow as much as our Lord in the Garden of Gethsemane? No. Right? It would be he sweat blood. He sweat blood from an excess of the passion of sorrow. Right? And this would be a perfect example of that overflow. His passion was spiritual, right? It was an affection of the will, of sorrow for all human sin. And having that sorrow for all human sin, because he's a human being, he's the man, the new Adam, he experienced the supreme overflow, as it were. In other words, he experienced it also physically, the sorrow. And so physically that it caused his capillaries being ruptured from the stress and the extremity of his emotion, such that he sweat blood. And doctors speak of this as a condition that occurs in the most extreme trauma, spiritual trauma. And so our Lord saw it. And we see many other cases. When Lazarus died, right, he wept, knowing full well that he was about to raise him from the tomb, but nevertheless, sorrow is fitting at death. Right? Death provokes sorrow. And we can see that Jesus had the most sensitive soul. That's so beautiful. And likewise, Our Lady would also be after Jesus the most sensitive person. And thus her joy and her sorrow would exceed that which less sensitive people would experience. No, so clearly it's not a goal of the spiritual life to get rid of passion. Right? The goal of the spiritual life is to channel emotions in accordance with reason, so that they help us to act all together for the good. In other words, with all of us, with all of our powers. St. Thomas has a beautiful article about this in the sermon, and he quotes a psalm, Psalm 83, verse 3, "My heart and my flesh have rejoiced in the living God." And so he asks, well, why does the psalmist say, "My heart and my flesh"? He sees in there my heart, the rational appetite, and my flesh, the sense appetite, and even the feelings that we physically experience. Right? Both of them participate in the spiritual movement, rejoicing in the living God. So the perfection of man doesn't consist in eliminating passion, but in making the passions participate in the order of reason, in the order of virtue, in the order of charity, above all. And so the Catechism of the Catholic Church, 1770, has a beautiful text. I think the writer of the Catechism is thinking of that line of St. Thomas. It says, "Moral perfection consists in man's being moved to the good, not by his will alone." Well, it's not just by willpower, but also by his sensitive appetite. As in the words of the Psalms, "My heart and my flesh sing for joy to the living God." But that can only happen when we develop virtue, right? That's, in other words, through the acquisition of virtue, our passions can participate in the movement of reason. Whereas the person with a vice, it'll be the opposite. It'll be being weighed down by unruly passions. Let's look briefly at temperament. Each one of us, because of our physical constitution, each one of us has an individual temperament that we receive at birth that we can't change. And it's difficult to define, but it seems, at least to me, that temperament is a kind of disposition resulting from our body to be naturally inclined to experience certain emotions or passions more intensely or less intensely. So because of our bodily constitution, we're made such that we'll experience certain things more deeply than another person, and other things less deeply than another person, in terms of emotions. Simply our emotional disposition is different than our neighbors. And we all experience that it's something that we can't directly change, that it's part of who we are. And the Greeks spoke about this in terms of four temperaments, right? The classical four temperaments, and they divided them, Hippocrates, they divided them according to what they thought were four fluids that predominated in the body, making the difference between the four temperaments. And so the names would be choleric or choleric, sanguine, melancholic, and phlegmatic. So sanguine would be a preponderance of blood. Phlegmatic, a preponderance of phlegm. Choleric, certain kind of choleric and melancholic, where black bile would be melancholic and another bile, I guess, would be the choleric. Now, we don't have to hold the fluids. But the interesting thing is that they recognize the connection with the body. Right? In other words, with And that's exactly right, that because of our physical constitution, which would be genetic, we tend to experience certain emotions more readily than others. Now, modern psychology comes up with different classifications, and they all could have different favorable points or less, but I'm just going to go with the 4 classical temperaments. And so the choleric or choleric person is marked by one who's quick to anger. Let's see, choleric is someone more prone to anger simply by his physical constitution. And at the same time, he'll be marked generally by energy, activity, an inclination to leadership, but also a proneness to pride or arrogance that he'll have to work against. Now, the phlegmatic would be the opposite. So the phlegmatic, simply by his bodily constitution, will be less emotionally involved, less inclined to anger, and therefore more easygoing, more patient, simply by, not by virtue, but by nature, as it were. Phlegmatic tend to be witty, rational, analytic, but on the downside, they can tend to sloth. But that's insofar, obviously, they can build up the virtue of diligence, but simply by temperament would be before subtracting from virtue and vice, just simply from the natural condition of our inclinations. The sanguine temperament would be inclined to joy, enthusiasm, optimism, sensitive to pleasure, but on the defect, likely to be inconstant precisely because of that sensitivity to pleasure. He'll likely be inconstant, impetuous, or prone to sensuality. And finally, the melancholic would be more deeply moved by the experience of sorrow. So able to experience sorrow more deeply, inclined to reflection, so to be more retentive, to keep things in, inclined to piety, perfectionism, but may tend to be excessively pessimistic, lacking in self-confidence because of that perfectionism, prone to scrupulosity, could be. The melancholic generally loves beauty, so very often the artist is melancholic. Now that's the myth of the artist as melancholic. Sensitive, empathetic, introspective, thinks about things in depth, but so very often too much. Could be. Now, in reality, all of us are probably a mixture of more than one of these 4. Right? And so if you just take each one of us could be dominant one and secondary another. Right? And so instead of just having 4, you'd have that way 16 possibilities. The 4 pure ones and then 12 blends, as it were. Now this doesn't come from Revelation, but it seems to correspond to human experience. No, and it makes sense given the fact that we're not pure souls, right? That we've got these bodies that are a fundamental part of our identity. And every temperament is at one and the same time a gift and a burden. Right? It's a gift because we're equipped by nature, as it were, to experience certain things more deeply. But it's a burden because we're less equipped to experience other things more deeply or experience things too deeply. And so insofar as it's an imbalance, it's a burden. But insofar as it gives us a strength, it's a gift. Right? And so every temperament will have both of those aspects. Right? And what can we do about it? Well, we can't change it directly because it's part of our body. And in fact, it would be terrible to try and, how could you get rid of our bodily identity? But what we do want to do is to bring about balance through what's voluntary, and that's acquiring virtue. And so we need to bring our temperaments into balance by working harder at the virtues that we're less inclined to. Right? In other words, if our particular temperament leads us in one direction, we'll have to work much harder at the virtues that go in the opposite direction. And that's where our principal attention should be in the spiritual life, to bring us back into balance. St. Ignatius of Loyola talks about this. He speaks about doing the diametrical opposite of our natural tendency. Not just once, but habitually, so as to build up the opposite virtues. And he speaks also about doing an examination of conscience precisely about my dominant fault. Well, my dominant fault will almost always be related to my temperament. Right? Because our temperament is imbalanced in one direction, if we don't correct that dominant tendency, it'll lead us to have a dominant fault. And so one way to combat that, in order to build up the opposite virtue, is to examine my dominant fault, and to take it into account when I make decisions and when I discern God's will. Right? And so that's why it's helpful. You need to have self-knowledge. And so it's helpful to know where we tend simply by nature, so that we can work harder on bringing ourselves into balance. Now, we're not responsible for our temperament, but what we are responsible for is precisely this bringing it into balance, and we call that character. So character is what we build up, the virtues that we build up on top of our temperament. And so both of them together, our temperament plus the acquired virtues and vices and the supernatural ones, that makes up our character. Right? And that is voluntary and will be judged by our character. Right? And so we can't say, that's just my character. No, if somebody says that, that's your lack of character. Right? In other words, now we don't want to sacrifice, right, the good points that come with our temperament. We want to keep those, right? But we just want to bring ourselves into balance by acquiring the opposite virtues. The classic example of this is St. Francis de Sales. It's hard to believe, but he's known as the saint of meekness, of gentleness, of sweet and mild, etc. But it's said that under his desk there are grooves that came from his fingernails. That he was by nature choleric temperament, prone to anger. But through work, through diligence, and obviously, above all, grace and sacramental graces, when we confess, in confession, let me little parenthesis, confession shouldn't be used only for mortal sins. We can confess our venial sins, and we can confess, in particular, the particular venial sins that we tend to fall into, particularly because of our temperament, probably. And by confessing them, we get also sacramental graces to combat them. And so, on the natural level, acquiring virtue, and then on the supernatural, the graces to gain the opposite supernatural virtues. That way we can overcome the limitations of our temperament. And so St. Francis de Sales would be a great example. The saint of patience, but in reality he was choleric. And it's true of all the saints. And should be true of all of us. Now, insofar as the temperaments are involved this imbalance, we can see them as a result of original sin. The imbalance. But even in Eden, here I'm just speculating, but it would seem reasonable to think that even in Eden, there would be temperament. Because there would be bodily individuality, there would be differences. So that's a good thing. So insofar as the temperament is a gift, it should have been there in Eden. But insofar as it's a burden, well, that's a result of the fall. That's a result of the loss of that gift of integrity by which our passions are subordinated to reason. And in an extreme case, I think we can't get into it, but psychological illness would involve extreme forms of imbalance in experiencing emotions and in the imagination that triggers those emotions, such that it would be involuntary. So an involuntary disorder in the way that passions are experienced, out of touch with reality. And that too would be a consequence of original sin. Okay, let's take our break, the refreshments, and then there'll be